I'm Shannon Ferrell with Oklahoma State University, and now that you've decided that you want to have a written agricultural lease, I'm going to tell you the 5 things that every lease needs to have in it. First, and perhaps obviously, is the names of the parties. And you're thinking to yourself, that seems like it's a pretty obvious thing. But what you need to be sure that you have correct is what are the actual legal names of the parties. If we're talking about individuals, let's make sure that we actually have their full legal name and also their marital status. Are they a single person or are they a married person? You may be asking yourself, why does that matter? Well, in certain states, if you want to convey any sort of interest in property, even if it's a lease, and you're married, you have to have your spouse sign off on that as well. Another reason that's important is that what if we're dealing with someone who's not an individual, but a business? Say we have a partnership or a corporation or an LLC. We need to have that name correct on the lease so we actually know which party is going to be held legally responsible for agreeing. The next thing, item number 2 that we need to have in the lease, is a full and correct legal description of the property. That legal description matters a lot because we need to understand exactly what are we getting in the lease and also what are we not getting in the lease. Something else you should consider alongside with that legal description is an actual map that shows which areas of the property are actually being conveyed in the lease. And if there are any areas where the tenant or the operator needs to stay away from, we should probably designate that as well. The third thing that we need to include in the lease is when does the lease start and when does it end. And although it may sound like the same question, we also need to address when can the operator enter the property and when do they have to leave. Sometimes we may enter a lease agreement now, but we only intend for the operator to enter the property at some later date. So we need to make sure that we're very clear about when the lease starts, when the operator can take possession of the property, and when they have to be gone. That also helps the operator understand when they need to make their production decisions, as in when can they start another crop. If the lease is going to end before they have the opportunity to harvest that crop, that's something that we need to think about. The fourth thing that we need to include that's obviously very important for both parties is what's the rent going to be and how is it going to be paid. If we're talking about a cash rental payment, when is that payment going to be made? Is it going to be made in one installment? Is it going to be made monthly, quarterly, at the start and at the end of the lease? Those are all things that are options. If we're talking about a share kind of lease, when is the operator going to be obligated to turn over the share of the crop to the landowner? And last but certainly not least, we need to have the signatures of the parties. And again, that may sound like something that's pretty obvious, but in most states, a written agreement can only be enforced against the party that signed the agreement. So if only one of the parties signs the agreement, the other party can enforce the lease against them, but not the other way around. So make sure that both parties have the lease signed, and in many states it's also a good idea to go and record the lease in the county land records so that external parties, third parties that may come and purchase the property later on, have notice of the lease, and that preserves the rights of both the landlord and the tenant. So those are the 5 things that every written agricultural lease definitely needs to include.